Every morning, just before 6, a German shepherd entered Harbor Lights Memorial and carried away one blue ribbon. He passed buckets of fresh fish without slowing. He ignored scraps beside the market stalls and never stepped across a grave marker. One ribbon, always one. Then he followed the same fog-covered road toward the abandoned ferry pier. After 18 ribbons vanished in less than 3 weeks, former Coast Guard rescuer Luke Mercer reviewed the security footage. The dog moved directly from wreath to wreath, inspecting each one before carefully pulling a single blue ribbon free. He held it gently between his teeth and left through the southern gate without running, hiding, or looking back. The following morning, Luke waited near the entrance. When the German shepherd appeared, Luke did not call out or try to stop him. He let the dog take the ribbon, then followed him through the sleeping harbor town. What Luke found waiting at the end of that journey would uncover a promise that death had failed to break, and force him to face the rescue he had spent 5 years trying to forget. 3 weeks earlier, before Luke Mercer ever waited beside the southern gate, Harbor Lights Memorial belonged almost entirely to the fog. It rolled in from Port Townsend Bay before sunrise, settling over the bronze plaques and low stone walls. Beyond the memorial, fishing boats rocked against their lines while the smell of salt, diesel, and wet rope drifted across the grounds. Luke arrived at 5:32 every morning he volunteered. At 42, he still carried the build of the Coast Guard rescuer he had once been, 6'2", broad-shouldered, with powerful forearms and the controlled movements of a man trained not to waste strength. His dark brown hair was cut short, and a thin scar ran from beneath his left ear toward the collar of his weatherproof jacket. His gray eyes constantly measured distances, exits, unstable surfaces, and changes in the weather. 5 years away from rescue work had not erased those habits. It had only made him quieter. Luke signed the volunteer ledger and loaded a narrow cart with polishing cloths, a soft brush, replacement cord, marine-grade screws, and bronze cleaner. Harbor Lights honored sailors, fishermen, ferry workers, and rescue personnel lost around the Olympic Peninsula. Some had graves elsewhere. Others had no grave at all. Luke preferred problems he could touch. Corrosion could be removed, loose fittings could be tightened. A frayed flag line could be replaced. Those tasks did not ask why one man returned from a storm while another vanished beneath it. He worked along the eastern wall, wiping moisture from a ferry engineer's plaque and replacing 2 rusted clips beneath a Coast Guard wreath. At the center of the memorial stood a black granite panel bearing the names of those never recovered. Luke stopped his cart before reaching it. Daniel Reed's name appeared on the 3rd column. Daniel had been 39 when the sea took him. A tall, lean fisherman with sun-browned skin, sandy hair that never stayed beneath a cap, and blue eyes that made every joke sound sincere. He repaired other men's engines before checking his own, and remembered every deckhand's child by name. Dangerous waters had made him cautious, but fatherhood had made him gentle. Whenever he spoke about his son Noah, his entire face changed. Luke had led the rescue crew the night Daniel disappeared. He cleaned every plaque surrounding Daniel's. He never touched Daniel's. At 6:14, Luke noticed the first missing ribbon. A large wreath stood near the harbor wall, placed after a service for 3 fishermen lost in a winter squall. White flowers circled the outside, and blue ribbons had been woven through the greenery. One ribbon was gone. Luke crouched beside the arrangement. The ribbon had not torn. No fabric remained on the wire frame. The flowers were upright, and the neighboring knots were undisturbed. Wind could be violent along the harbor, but wind was rarely precise. He recorded the damage and continued working. 2 mornings later, another ribbon vanished from a wreath beside the bell tower. Then another disappeared near the southern walkway. Nothing else was taken. Challenge coins remained beneath plaques. Notes stayed under stones. Photographs, candles, insignias, and miniature flags were untouched. Even the wreaths looked almost undisturbed. Luke bought a pocket notebook from a pharmacy near Water Street. On each page he recorded the date, approximate time, location, weather, and condition of the affected wreath. By the seventh entry, Patricia Caldwell noticed. Patricia managed harbor lights with the discipline of someone who believed disorder spread when ignored. 56, medium height and straight-backed, she wore her silver blonde hair in a severe chin-length cut. Her navy coat was always properly buttoned, and she carried a ring of labeled keys arranged by size. She was not cruel, but an accident early in her career, when a visitor fell near an unsecured work area, had made her deeply cautious about liability. She found Luke measuring the distance between two affected wreaths. "You mapping missing ribbon now?" she asked. 7 pieces in 9 days. We live beside the water. The knots weren't broken. Patricia glanced toward the harbor, where the flags strained in the wind. Then someone untied them. Nothing else is missing. That should make you grateful, not suspicious. Luke closed the notebook. Patricia's expression softened. She knew enough about his final rescue mission to understand that unanswered patterns could hold him too tightly. "Do your repairs," she said. "Let me handle problems people actually report." Luke nodded, but he continued recording the disappearances. On the 12th morning, he noticed someone watching him from beyond the stone wall. Noah Reed was 17, tall but still growing into his narrow frame. He had inherited Daniel's sandy hair, though his fell across his forehead, and his hands were marked by grease from part-time work around the docks. Since losing his father, Noah's natural quietness had hardened into mistrust. He distrusted official explanations, especially those given by the man who had led the unsuccessful search. Luke met his eyes. Noah looked toward Daniel's untouched plaque, then back at Luke. The accusation required no words. After several seconds, he turned and walked toward the market. Luke watched him leave, but made no attempt to follow. There had been a time when Noah ran toward him whenever the rescue crews returned to the harbor. Back then, the boy had asked Luke questions about helicopters, survival suits, and how rescuers could see anything through storm waves. After Daniel disappeared, Noah stopped asking questions. Luke understood why. By the 18th day, 18 blue ribbons had vanished. He spread his notes across the maintenance workbench, weighting the pages with a screwdriver so the draft beneath the door would not move them. Every ribbon had disappeared before 6:15. Every affected wreath stood near a path connected to the southern gate. None disappeared during visiting hours, and none came from the northern half of the memorial. No money had been taken. No valuable military insignia had been removed. No wreath had been torn apart. The pattern was not random. That morning, Luke carried his notebook toward the fish market. The harbor was slowly waking. Workers scraped ice across metal tables, delivery trucks reversed between narrow buildings, and gulls circled above the roofs while calling to one another through the fog. Earl Donnelly was arranging halibut beneath a hanging scale. 63, heavy-set and red-cheeked from decades of cold mornings. Earl wore orange rubber overalls and a wool cap pulled low over his ears. He laughed easily, spoke loudly, and knew nearly everything that moved through the harbor before sunrise. He had sold fish to Daniel for years and had never learned how to speak quietly, even when discussing the dead. Luke placed the notebook on the edge of the counter. Earl glanced at the pages. "You think somebody's stealing decorations?" "I think something leaves through the south side around 6. Earl stopped arranging the fish. For once, his expression became serious. "Well," he said, "there's that big shepherd." Luke lowered his eyes toward the notebook. "What shepherd?" "Dark-backed German shepherd. Comes through before the delivery trucks arrive." "Is someone walking him?" "Never seen anybody with him." Earl removed one glove and scratched the gray stubble along his jaw. "Strangest part is he never bothers the fish. Walks right past dropped salmon, bait buckets, everything. A dog ignoring this market has somewhere more important to be." "How often have you seen him?" "Most mornings lately." "Where does he come from?" "Couldn't tell you." "Where does he go?" Earl pointed with his bare hand toward the fog beyond the southern road. "Same direction every time." Luke turned toward Harbor Lights Memorial. From the market entrance, the southern gate was barely visible through the mist. A section of iron fencing appeared and disappeared whenever the fog shifted. He thought about the intact wreaths, the carefully loosened ribbons, the narrow path connecting every affected memorial to that gate. Behind him, Earl returned to arranging the halibut. "You planning to catch him?" he asked. Luke did not answer immediately. He opened the notebook and added one final line beneath the 18th entry. "Large German shepherd seen near the southern road before 6. Repeated route. No interest in food." Then he closed the cover. For the first time, the missing ribbons no longer looked like objects being carried away. They looked like the beginning of a route. Luke returned to Harbor Lights Memorial before the afternoon fog had lifted from the water. The notebook remained in the inside pocket of his jacket, its 18 entries no longer describing a series of unexplained losses, but a route followed by a living animal. Earl Donnelly's final observation stayed with him. A dog ignoring a fish market had somewhere more important to be. The memorial's security system was housed in a narrow office behind the maintenance room. Patricia Caldwell sat at the desk reviewing invoices, her silver blonde hair tucked neatly behind one ear and her reading glasses balanced low on her nose. When Luke asked to see the recordings from the southern gate, she looked at him for several seconds before setting down her pen. "This is still about the ribbons?" "Earl has seen a German shepherd passing the harbor before 6, Patricia leaned back. "A stray dog explains missing decorations more easily than whatever theory you were building. Then the footage should settle it." She disliked investigations that began without formal complaints, but she disliked unresolved liability even more. After making Luke sign the equipment access sheet, she unlocked the recording archive and moved aside. The cameras had been installed to monitor vehicles, vandalism, and people entering after hours. None pointed directly at the wreaths, but 2 overlapping views captured the southern walkway and part of the memorial wall. Luke began with the previous morning. At 5:41, the screen showed fog moving across the pavement in pale bands. A delivery truck passed outside the fence. 2 gulls landed near a trash container and fought over a paper wrapper. At 5:58, a dark shape appeared beneath the lowest rail of the southern gate. Patricia leaned closer. The German shepherd entered without hesitation. He was larger than Luke had expected, though his body had grown thin enough for the outline of his ribs to show beneath his dark saddle coat. Amber fur covered his legs and lower chest. His right rear foot touched the ground slightly later than the others, creating an uneven rhythm that became more noticeable whenever he turned. An old leather collar circled his neck, cracked by rain and salt air. The metal identification plate was missing, leaving 2 empty holes in the strap. The dog paused inside the gate and listened. He did not lower his head toward the trash container. He ignored a half-eaten breakfast sandwich beside the maintenance building and walked past a paper tray stained with fish oil. His ears remained forward, and his gaze stayed fixed on the memorial paths. "He's been here before," Luke said. Patricia folded her arms. "Or he smells the flowers." The shepherd approached the first wreath and inspected it without touching anything. At the second, he smelled the greenery near the base. He passed a third arrangement containing white lilies and red carnations, then stopped before a wreath woven with several blue ribbons. He examined each section carefully, shifting his head until he found a ribbon near the outer edge. His front teeth caught the loose end. He pulled once, felt resistance, and released it. Instead of tearing harder, he moved to the opposite side of the knot and drew the fabric through the greenery in small, controlled movements. The flowers barely trembled. When the ribbon came free, he held it gently between his teeth and turned toward the southern gate. "That's not scavenging," Luke said. Patricia did not answer. They reviewed the previous recordings. The pattern remained nearly identical. Some mornings, the dog entered from the corner of the service lane. On others, he slipped beneath the raised section of fence. He never approached visitors, never crossed a grave marker, and never took a ribbon while anyone was standing nearby. Once, a maintenance worker left an open bag of smoked salmon beside a cart. The shepherd passed within 3 feet of it without slowing. Another morning, he stopped when a family entered the northern path, backed into the shadow of the harbor wall, and waited until they left before continuing. Luke watched the dog choose one ribbon from each wreath with the patience of someone completing a familiar task. "He understands boundaries," Luke said. "He understands repetition," Patricia replied. "That does not mean he's safe. It means he isn't wandering." Patricia closed the archive window. "You have your answer. The animal is removing the ribbons. I know what he's doing here. I still don't know why." Her expression tightened. "Do not chase him through town, Luke." "I wasn't planning to chase him. That is not the same as saying you'll leave him alone." Luke removed the access sheet from the desk and signed the time beside his name. Patricia had known him long enough to recognize when he had already made a decision. If he becomes aggressive, you call animal control. He hasn't shown aggression. Then let's keep it that way. The next morning, Luke reached the southern gate at 5:30. He brought no food, leash, or equipment that might make the dog believe he was being trapped. He stood beside the inner wall where he could be seen from the raised section of fence. Fog covered the harbor more heavily than the day before, softening the lamps along the road and reducing the boats to dark shapes beyond the seawall. Luke kept his hands visible and his posture relaxed. At 5:57, the German Shepherd appeared beneath the gate. The dog froze when he saw him. Up close, the old injury in the rear leg was clearer. The joint had healed poorly, and the muscles above it were thinner than those on the opposite side. A narrow scar divided the fur along his left ear. His brown eyes were alert, but not wild. He studied Luke's face, hands, and feet, measuring the distance between them. Luke stepped away from the path. "I'm not stopping you," he said quietly. The shepherd remained still for another moment, then entered. He gave Luke a wide distance and followed the same route shown on the recordings. At the first wreath, he found no blue ribbon and moved on. At the second, the available ribbon was tied deep beneath a metal emblem. He smelled it but did not pull. The third arrangement held 3 blue ribbons around its outer greenery. The dog selected the loosest one, drew it free without damaging the flowers, and turned toward the gate. Luke waited until the shepherd had crossed the service lane before following. He kept 20 yards between them, adjusting his pace whenever the dog slowed. The old instincts returned without invitation. During Coast Guard searches, Luke had learned to read more than footprints. He watched how fog moved around obstacles, where pedestrians naturally looked, which surfaces carried sound, and how reflections in shop windows could reveal movement without requiring him to stare directly ahead. He did not hide, but he avoided becoming pressure behind the animal. The shepherd crossed the southern road and entered the fish market. Workers were stacking insulated boxes beneath striped awnings. Meltwater ran across the pavement toward the drains. A small silver fish had fallen beside one table, its scales reflecting the weak morning light. The dog smelled it as he passed, but the blue ribbon remained between his teeth. Earl spotted Luke from behind his counter. His eyebrows rose when he noticed the shepherd ahead, but Luke placed one finger briefly against his lips. Earl nodded and returned to his work without calling out. Near the opposite end of the market, Noah Reed was unloading empty crates from a handcart. His sandy hair was hidden beneath a dark wool cap, and grease marked one sleeve of his jacket. He saw Luke first, then followed Luke's gaze toward the dog. Suspicion narrowed his eyes. Luke continued without acknowledging him. Noah waited until both Luke and the shepherd had passed the final stall. Then he abandoned the handcart beside the wall and followed. He stayed farther back than Luke, moving between parked trucks and storefronts. Luke caught Noah's reflection in the glass of a closed cafe, but gave no sign that he had noticed. Calling the boy out would end the pursuit, or force Noah to deny what he was doing. Luke preferred to know where he was. The shepherd reached the intersection beside the ferry terminal and stopped at the red light. Cars moved through the crossing, their tires hissing across damp pavement. He waited at the curb rather than searching for an opening. When the pedestrian signal changed, he crossed within the painted lines. Halfway through the intersection, a ferry horn sounded across the bay. The blast rolled between the buildings with enough force to vibrate the terminal windows. The shepherd's entire body tightened. his ears flattened, and the injured rear leg nearly folded beneath him. For 1 second, Luke believed he might drop the ribbon and run. Instead, the dog widened his stance and lowered his head until the sound faded. The blue fabric never touched the ground. A second horn sounded, lower and longer. The shepherd looked toward the water, breathing rapidly through his nose. Then he lifted his head and continued. Luke crossed after him. Behind them, Noah remained near the terminal wall, no longer pretending he had reached the intersection by accident. The shepherd left the commercial streets and turned toward the older waterfront road. The shops grew smaller, the sidewalks narrower, and the harbor sounds faded behind the fog. Luke recognized that the animal had made every turn without searching or hesitation. The ribbon was not a prize. It was not something he intended to chew, hide, or exchange for food. It was being carried somewhere. Ahead, the German shepherd disappeared briefly behind a row of weathered buildings, then emerged on the road leading toward the abandoned ferry district. Luke slowed, preserving the distance between them. Noah's footsteps followed somewhere behind him. Neither of them yet knew who, or what, was waiting at the end of the route. The German shepherd continued along the waterfront road, carrying the blue ribbon as carefully as if it were something fragile enough to break between his teeth. The abandoned ferry district emerged slowly through the fog. Rusted signs leaned above boarded ticket windows, weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement, and the old terminal clock remained frozen at 11:17, the hour its electrical system had failed nearly 12 years earlier. Port Townsend had built a newer terminal farther north, leaving this section of the harbor to gulls, fishermen seeking quiet water, and people who preferred places the town had stopped watching. Luke followed at the same measured distance, while Noah remained behind them, moving close to the empty buildings. The boy believed he was hidden, but his reflection appeared in dark windows whenever he crossed an open stretch of road. Luke still gave no indication that he had noticed. The shepherd passed through a gap in the chain-link fence surrounding the old ferry property. A faded warning sign stated that the pier was closed beyond the first platform, though someone had cut the wire securing the pedestrian gate. Luke inspected the boards before stepping onto them. Most were weathered but solid. The dog knew which sections to avoid, keeping close to the eastern railing where the timber had been reinforced. His injured rear leg struck the wood with a soft, uneven rhythm. 3 steady taps, then a lighter fourth. The sound traveled ahead through the fog. At the far end of the safe section stood a wooden bench facing the bay. A woman sat there with her back straight and both hands resting on the handle of a folded cane. She appeared to be in her early 70s, slender beneath a long moss-green coat, with silver hair braided loosely and pinned at the base of her neck. Her face carried the fine lines of someone who had spent much of her life near wind and salt water, but there was nothing fragile in the way she held herself. Her pale blue eyes remained directed toward the water without following the movement of the gulls, suggesting that her sight was limited. A small hearing device curved behind her right ear. Years of gradually losing both sight and hearing had made her attentive to vibrations, familiar rhythms, and changes in the air around her. She disliked being guided without permission and had learned every usable board of the pier by the pressure beneath her shoes. The shepherd saw her and quickened his pace. The irregular beat of his steps became faster against the timber. The woman's expression changed before he reached the bench. She lifted her head, listening through the hearing device and feeling the vibration pass through the boards. One hand left the cane and opened beside her knee. "You took your time this morning," she said. The dog stopped directly in front of her. He lowered his muzzle and placed the blue ribbon across her open palm. The woman closed her fingers around the fabric with practiced care, then ran her thumb along its edge, as though checking for damage. Only after completing that inspection did she reach forward and touch the shepherd's forehead. Her fingers found the scar along his left ear, moved beneath his jaw, and settled against the worn leather collar. "Good boy, Ranger," she whispered. The name seemed to release something in the dog. His posture softened, and he lay beside her boots with his shoulder pressed against her lower leg. Luke remained near the entrance to the pier. Until that moment, the missing ribbons had been evidence of a repeated action. Watching the woman hold one transformed them into something closer to a message. Noah had stopped behind a support post several yards back. His face was partly hidden, but Luke saw his attention fixed on Ranger and the woman. Neither of them moved until Ranger turned his head and looked directly at Luke. The woman noticed the change immediately. Her hand remained on the dog's neck. "Someone came with you," she said. Luke stepped forward slowly, allowing his boots to sound clearly against the boards. "I'm sorry. I followed him from Harbor Lights." Her face turned toward his voice. "The memorial?" "Yes, my name is Luke Mercer. I volunteer there." She considered the name, but gave no sign that she recognized it. "Helen Ward," she replied. "And you already know Ranger." Luke stopped several feet from the bench. "I know what you call him now." Helen touched the ribbon again. "Is something wrong?" Luke explained that blue ribbons had been disappearing from memorial reefs for 18 mornings. He described the security recordings, Ranger's careful behavior, and the route through the fish market. He made it clear that the dog had damaged nothing and had ignored every opportunity to take food. Helen listened without interruption. When he finished, her fingers tightened around the ribbon. "He's been taking them from graves?" "From wreaths at the Harbor Memorial," Luke said gently. "Always one, never more." The certainty left her face. "I thought Thomas had shown him where to find them." Thomas Ward had been 74 when he died, 1 month earlier. Helen described him as a tall, narrow-shouldered man with weathered hands, a white beard he trimmed unevenly, and deep-set brown eyes that became almost youthful whenever a machine returned to life beneath his tools. He had worked as a marine mechanic for more than 40 years, repairing ferry engines, fishing boat winches, navigation lights, and anything else owners carried into his workshop. Thomas was patient with damaged machinery and impatient with people who declared something useless before examining it properly. A boiler explosion when he was 32 had left scars across his left forearm and a permanent ringing in one ear. Instead of making him fearful, the accident made him methodical. He checked every valve twice, taught young workers never to hide mistakes, and refused to rush a repair merely because an impatient captain was waiting. He believed most disasters began with someone being too proud to admit they had missed something, Helen said. The blue ribbon ritual had begun decades earlier. Before Thomas boarded a vessel for an offshore repair, he tied a strip of blue cloth around the railing outside the old ferry terminal. Blue had been the color of the dress Helen wore the afternoon they first met on that same pier. At the time, she was 23 and working at the ticket counter, while Thomas was a young mechanic arguing with a supervisor about an unsafe engine seal. Helen had watched him refuse to approve the ferry until the problem was repaired, even though it cost him a week's wages. "I thought he was the most stubborn man I had ever seen," she said. "Then I realized stubbornness can look a great deal like courage when someone uses it for another person." Whenever Thomas returned safely, he removed the ribbon and brought it to Helen. Early in their marriage, she kept the ribbons inside a glass jar. Later, the ritual became simpler. He would place one in her hand and she would know he had returned before he said anything. Even after retirement, Thomas continued tying a ribbon to the pier railing whenever he crossed the bay to repair a friend's boat. The journey became shorter, but the promise remained the same. Ranger entered their lives during the previous winter. He had appeared behind Thomas's workshop during a freezing rain, too suspicious to approach the food left beneath the awning. For 11 days, Thomas placed a bowl outside and returned indoors without watching. He understood that kindness offered too insistently could feel like another trap. Eventually, Ranger remained while Thomas locked the shop. A week later, he followed Thomas to the harbor. Thomas never claimed to own him, but he repaired the old collar, treated the injured leg as well as the dog would allow, and began leaving the workshop door open during storms. Ranger trusted Thomas because Thomas never demanded proof of gratitude, Helen said. He simply kept showing up. Ranger had watched the blue ribbon ritual many times. He waited near the old railing while Thomas tied the cloth, then followed him back to the pier after each job. When Thomas died suddenly from a heart attack at the workshop, Ranger disappeared for several days. On the morning after the funeral, Helen returned to the bench because remaining inside the house felt less bearable than waiting beside an empty sea. Ranger arrived carrying a blue ribbon. "I assumed Thomas had kept a supply somewhere," Helen said. "Perhaps in the workshop or beneath the back steps." Luke looked at the strip in her hand. One end carried faint impressions where it had been woven through the memorial wreath. He must have started at Harbor Lights because Thomas's service was held there. Helen lowered her face. The explanation brought comfort and pain in equal measure. Ranger had not been trained to steal. He had connected the place where Thomas disappeared from his life with the object Thomas always carried back to Helen. "He thinks he is finishing the journey," Luke said. Helen's thumb stopped against the ribbon. "No," she answered quietly. "He thinks Thomas still needs him to." Behind them, a board creaked. Noah stepped partly out from the support post before stopping himself. Helen turned toward the sound, but Luke spoke first. "You can come out, Noah." The boy's jaw tightened. He approached with his hands buried in his jacket pockets, embarrassed at being discovered but unwilling to apologize. Helen asked who he was. "Noah Reed," he said. "My father's name is on the memorial." Her expression softened. "Then you understand why people keep returning to places that hurt them?" Noah glanced at Luke. "Some people return because they feel guilty." Luke accepted the accusation without defending himself. He explained only that Noah had followed them from the fish market. Helen rested one hand on Ranger's shoulder. "And do you believe Mr. Mercer means to help him?" she asked. Noah looked at the blue ribbon, then at the man he had blamed for 5 years. "I believe he wants to know where the dog goes," he said. "That isn't the same thing." Luke did not argue. Trust, like Ranger's decision to enter Thomas's workshop, could not be forced by standing too close. The fog began thinning over the bay. Helen folded the ribbon and placed it inside her coat pocket. Ranger remained against her leg, his breathing slow and settled. Luke understood that reporting what he had found would create questions about the dog's ownership, his access to the memorial, and the removal of items left by grieving families. He also understood that none of those questions could be answered by pretending the ritual caused no harm. "I'll speak with Patricia," he said. "We'll find a way for him to bring you a ribbon without taking one from a wreath." Helen turned toward his voice. "You cannot promise what other people will allow." "No," Luke said, "but I can make sure they understand the whole story before they decide." Noah watched him with the same cold doubt he had carried on to the pier. Ranger lifted his head, the worn collar shifting against his fur. For that morning, the dog had completed his task. The blue ribbon had reached the woman waiting at the end of the route. What happened to the ritual next would depend on people. And people, Luke knew, were rarely as careful with fragile things as Ranger had been. Luke walked Helen home by the waterfront road, while Ranger moved between them, never straying farther than a few steps from her side. Helen refused his arm when the pavement narrowed, but she allowed him to warn her about a loose drainage grate and a delivery bicycle leaning across the sidewalk. Noah followed at a distance until they reached the blue-painted gate outside Helen's small cedar house. He stopped beneath a cottonwood tree and pretended to study his phone, though Luke knew he was watching. Helen unlocked the gate by touch and turned toward the uneven sound of Ranger's breathing. "Thomas's workshop is 2 streets behind the old dry dock," she said. "The key is beneath the brass compass beside the kitchen door. He believed hiding places were safer when everyone in the family knew them." She paused before adding, "There may be ribbons there. If there are, bring them to me before anyone decides Ranger is a thief." Luke promised only that he would look. He had learned long ago that promises became dangerous when they depended on what other people might do. The workshop stood at the end of a gravel lane behind a row of storage sheds. Its corrugated roof had rusted along the edges, and the faded sign above the double doors still read "Ward Marine Repair" in hand-painted blue letters. Salt air had peeled part of the final word away, leaving only Repa visible from the road. Luke found the brass compass mounted beside the side entrance and lifted it from its hook. A small iron key rested in a shallow recess behind it. The door opened with resistance, dragging across a floor swollen by years of damp weather. Inside, the air smelled of machine oil, cedar shavings, old rope and metal heated too many times beneath a welding torch. Tools hung in precise outlines along the walls. Each wrench, gauge, and screwdriver had its own place, marked in black pencil on a pale wooden board. Thomas had organized the room for hands that could work even when the lights failed. Ranger entered before Luke. The dog moved past the workbench, ignored a sack of dried food near the back wall, and went directly to a scarred oak desk beneath the window. He circled once, then lay beside the chair with his muzzle facing the closed door. The position was too exact to be accidental. Luke imagined Thomas sitting there at the end of the day, writing invoices or repairing a small instrument, while Ranger waited beside him for the sound of keys being put away. Now the dog watched the empty chair as though absence were another kind of delay. Luke examined the shelves without touching anything unnecessarily. Several glass jars held bolts separated by size. A row of marine gauges rested beneath canvas covers. On the central table, a set of plans had been weighted flat beneath a brass propeller. The top sheet showed the frame of a 16-foot wooden launch with a reinforced bow, shallow draft, and unusually wide rear platform. Thomas's handwriting filled the margins with measurements, revisions, and questions about weight distribution. Near the bottom, he had written a name in block letters: Safe Return. Only half the hull had been completed. The ribs stood on a cradle in the adjoining bay, pale wood curving upward like the bones of an unfinished animal. "You found it." Noah's voice came from the doorway. He had removed his wool cap, revealing wind-tossed, sandy hair and the tense expression he carried whenever Luke came too close to anything connected to Daniel. He stepped inside but remained near the exit. "You knew about the boat?" Luke asked. "My father helped Thomas start it." Luke looked toward the incomplete hull. "No one told me." "No one told you a lot of things." Noah walked to the work table and ran 2 fingers along the edge of the blueprint. His hands were long and narrow like Daniel's, but the knuckles were roughened from hauling crates and repairing small outboard motors at the harbor. He tried to hide how much he understood about machinery because skill inherited from his father felt too close to grief. "Dad worked here on Saturdays," Noah said. "Thomas taught him precision work, gauge calibration, fuel systems, electrical faults. Dad said fishing taught you how to endure problems, but Thomas taught you how to solve them." "Did you work here too?" "Sometimes, before the storm." The final words changed the room. Ranger lifted his head but did not rise. Luke turned toward the desk. Its upper drawers opened easily, containing receipts, pencils, and envelopes arranged by month. The lowest drawer remained locked. The iron key from behind the compass did not fit. Noah crossed the room and reached beneath the workbench. He removed a magnetic tin attached to the underside of the frame. "Thomas kept duplicate keys where salt water couldn't reach them," he said. Inside the tin were 3 small keys, each tagged with faded tape. The second opened the drawer. A thick brown journal lay beneath a folded shop apron. Its leather cover had darkened where Thomas's hands had held it, and a blue ribbon marked a place near the final pages. Luke carried it to the work table. Noah moved closer despite himself. The early entries contained repair records, weather notes, names of vessels, and observations about failing components. Thomas wrote with the patience of a man who expected every detail to matter later. Halfway through the journal, the entries became more personal. He described the stray German shepherd appearing behind the shop during freezing rain, the old injury in the rear leg, and the dog's refusal to enter enclosed spaces. Day 6. Food gone before dawn. He watches from behind the fuel drums. Fear is not the same as aggression. People confuse them because aggression makes them angry, while fear makes them impatient. Luke glanced toward Ranger. The dog had lowered his head again, but his eyes remained fixed on the journal. Later entries described Thomas leaving the doors open during storms and teaching Ranger the route between the workshop, the old ferry pier, and Helen's house. Thomas never used commands at first. He walked the route, waited at every crossing, and allowed the dog to choose whether to follow. When Ranger began accompanying him regularly, Thomas taught him to stop at curbs, avoid the market traffic, and wait when ferry horns sounded. He didn't teach Ranger to get the ribbons, Noah said. Not directly. Luke turned several pages. Thomas described tying the blue ribbon to the pier railing before crossing the bay. Ranger watched each time. When Thomas returned, the dog followed him as he removed the ribbon and brought it to Helen. One entry had been written 2 months before Thomas died. Ranger now reaches Helen before I do. He knows the ribbon means the journey is over. Perhaps that is all trust is, learning which signs mean someone came back. Noah read the sentence twice. Near the final pages, Daniel Reed's name appeared. Luke's hand stopped. Thomas had written about an accident 9 years earlier when an engine room fire broke out aboard a trawler during a repair trip. Smoke filled the lower deck, trapping Thomas beneath a fallen access panel. Daniel, despite having no protective equipment beyond wet cloth wrapped around his face, crawled into the compartment and pulled him toward the ladder. A fuel line ruptured seconds after they reached the deck. Thomas's account described Daniel not as reckless, but as someone incapable of abandoning another person once he knew where they were. He never told me that, Noah said. He probably didn't want you measuring him by the most dangerous thing he ever did. Noah looked sharply at Luke. You don't get to explain him to me. Luke accepted the correction. The next entry mentioned Noah directly. Daniel worries the boy will stay at the docks because grief can disguise itself as duty. Noah has the hands for marine mechanics and the patience he pretends not to have. Daniel wants him trained properly. Somewhere skill matters more than family reputation. I told him I would teach the boy when he was ready. Noah turned away from the page. My father didn't plan on leaving, he said. No, but you came back. The accusation carried the same force as before, only now it was surrounded by Thomas's tools and Daniel's hopes. Luke reached inside his jacket but stopped before removing what he carried there. For 5 years, Daniel's brass rescue whistle had remained in Luke's possession. The whistle was dented along one edge and attached to a short length of red cord. Luke had found it tangled in the safety line recovered after the storm. He had carried it through 3 apartments, 2 temporary jobs, and every morning at Harbor Lights. Many times he had intended to give it to Noah. Each time, shame had convinced him that returning it would look like a request for forgiveness. His fingers closed around the whistle through the fabric. Not yet. There may be more records, Luke said. Thomas could have kept radio notes, repair logs, or letters from your father. We can go through them together. Noah stepped back from the work table. You think a journal changes what happened? It may tell us something we didn't know. I know enough. My father was out there. You were leading the rescue. You called off the search. The storm made continued air operations impossible. That is what the report says. It is what happened. Noah's face hardened. Then why do you look at his name like you're afraid it will answer back? Luke had no response that would not sound defensive. Noah took his cap from his pocket. Before leaving, he looked once at the unfinished boat and then at Ranger, lying beside Thomas's chair. You can search the workshop, he said. Just don't pretend you're doing it for me. The door closed behind him. Ranger raised his head at the sound, then settled again beside the empty desk. Across town, Patricia Caldwell stood behind the administration counter at Harbor Lights while a maintenance clerk handed her 2 written visitor complaints. One reported a large dog moving without a leash near the Southern Memorial Path. The other stated that an elderly couple had felt uncomfortable when the same animal appeared beneath the gate, even though it had not approached them. Patricia read both statements carefully. She remembered Luke insisting that Ranger understood boundaries. She also remembered the visitor who had fallen years earlier because she had delayed closing an unsafe walkway. Good intentions had not protected the woman's wrist or Patricia's record. She placed the complaints in a folder marked Southgate, Animal Access. Back in the workshop, Luke copied the pages about Ranger, Daniel, and Noah without removing the journal. He covered the unfinished boat plans with canvas and locked the desk again. Before turning off the light, he looked toward Ranger. The German shepherd remained beside Thomas's chair, waiting with the patience of an animal that had not yet accepted that some doors would never open again. The following morning, Luke returned to Harbor Lights Memorial carrying photocopies of Thomas Ward's journal entries and a short length of clean blue ribbon. He found Patricia Caldwell in the administration office, standing beside the window with the 2 visitor complaints open on her desk. Ranger's repeated route had become more than a private curiosity. It was now a documented concern, and Patricia treated documented concerns as things that could no longer be ignored. Luke placed the copied pages in front of her and explained everything he had learned. Thomas's decades-old promise to Helen, Ranger's connection to the workshop, and the dog's attempt to continue the ritual after Thomas died. Patricia read without speaking. Her face softened briefly at Thomas's description of trust, but her attention returned to the complaints. "The story explains his behavior," she said. "It does not make the grounds unrestricted." "Then we change the route," Luke replied. He suggested placing 1 blue ribbon outside the southern gate each morning. Ranger would no longer need to enter the memorial or approach the wreaths. Luke would supervise on the days he volunteered, and the ribbon could be tied loosely to the fence where the dog would find it. Patricia looked toward the harbor, considering the difference between compassion and responsibility. "I'll review it," she said. "Until then, I will not call animal control." Luke studied her expression. "You're giving me your word?" "I'm telling you I'll consider the arrangement before taking further action." It was not the same promise, but it was close enough for Luke to leave believing time remained. For 2 mornings, Ranger entered Harbor Lights without incident. He waited when visitors crossed the path, chose 1 ribbon, and left through the southern gate. On the 3rd morning, a woman named Melissa Grant arrived with her 6-year-old daughter to visit the memorial plaque of Melissa's brother. Melissa was 34, petite and sharply dressed in a gray wool coat, with dark hair tied in a low ponytail and a nervous habit of gripping her daughter's shoulder whenever unfamiliar people or animals came too close. As a teenager, Melissa had been bitten by an uncontrolled dog outside a grocery store. The scar on her forearm had faded, but the fear had not. Ranger emerged from behind the harbor wall while Melissa was kneeling beside the plaque. He saw the child and immediately changed direction, giving them several yards of space. He did not bark, approach, or look at them again. The girl pointed toward him with curiosity. Melissa turned, saw a large German shepherd without a leash, and pulled her daughter behind her. "Get away!" she shouted. Ranger stopped. His ears moved backward and his injured leg shifted beneath him. Luke, working near the bell tower, heard the cry and hurried across the path. Ranger did not move toward Melissa. He lowered his head and backed away. "He isn't approaching you," Luke said. "I don't care," Melissa answered, holding her daughter close. "He shouldn't be here without an owner." Patricia arrived moments later. She listened to Melissa's complaint, took her contact information, and apologized for the distress. Luke explained Ranger's restraint, but Patricia's attention remained fixed on the frightened child. No injury had occurred. Still, she knew that liability often began before anyone was harmed. Years earlier, Patricia had supervised a public waterfront garden where visitors frequently ignored leash rules. One afternoon, an unleashed retriever ran toward an elderly man carrying a cane. The dog had only wanted attention, but the man stepped backward, fell from a low curb, and fractured his hip. Patricia had previously received 2 informal warnings about loose animals and had postponed stricter enforcement because none had shown aggression. After the accident, the city placed a written reprimand in her personnel file. The injured man recovered slowly and never returned to the garden. Patricia had carried the incident into every decision since. To Luke, Ranger's restraint proved he could be managed. To Patricia, it proved only that nothing had gone wrong yet. Luke was scheduled to repair storm-damaged railing at a rescue station outside town the next morning. Before leaving Harbor Lights, he tied a blue ribbon outside the southern gate and reminded Patricia of their discussion. "It will keep him away from the wreaths," Patricia looked at the ribbon moving in the wind. I see it. And you'll wait until I'm back? I said I would review the situation. Luke heard the distinction but had no authority to demand more. He drove away believing Patricia would allow one more morning. Before sunrise, Patricia removed the ribbon from the fence. She told herself it might encourage Ranger to return regularly, creating an unofficial system the memorial had never approved. Then she called Jefferson County Animal Services. The officer who arrived was Marcus Bell, a 48-year-old man with a broad chest, a shaved head, and a carefully trimmed black and gray beard. He had worked animal control for 13 years and had learned to distrust dramatic descriptions from both frightened citizens and overconfident owners. A bite from a neglected mastiff had damaged 2 fingers on his left hand early in his career, yet the experience had made him more observant rather than cruel. He preferred patience, distance, and quiet equipment over force. Patricia showed him the complaints, the security footage, and the gap beneath the southern gate. She mentioned that the dog removed decorations but did not explain Helen, Thomas, or the reason behind the ribbons. Has he threatened anyone? Marcus asked. Not yet, Patricia said. The answer made him glance at her, but he continued preparing a slip lead. Noah arrived at the fish market shortly before 6. He was unloading crates when he noticed the county vehicle parked near harbor lights. Through the fog, he saw Marcus standing beside the southern walkway and Patricia waiting near the administration building. Noah abandoned the crates and ran across the service road. Ranger had already entered the memorial. Finding no ribbon outside the gate, he moved toward the nearest wreath containing blue fabric. Marcus did not chase him. He stood sideways, lowering his body slightly and allowing the loop of the lead to hang loose. Ranger selected a ribbon and carefully drew it free. When he turned, he saw Marcus blocking the most direct route to the gate. The dog stopped. Marcus spoke in a calm, even voice and extended the loop without reaching over Ranger's head. Ranger glanced toward the opening beneath the fence, then back at the man. He could have run between the plaques. Instead, he remained still. Marcus moved one step closer. The loop passed over Ranger's head and settled around his neck. The shepherd flinched, but did not growl or bare his teeth. "No!" Noah shouted from the road. Ranger turned toward the familiar voice. The blue ribbon remained clenched gently between his teeth. Noah reached the gate as Marcus began guiding the dog toward the county vehicle. "He belongs to someone," Noah said. "Who?" Marcus asked. Noah hesitated. Thomas was dead. Helen had never legally owned Ranger. Luke had not yet taken responsibility for him. "He has somewhere he goes," Noah said. "That isn't ownership," Patricia replied. Noah looked at her with open anger. "You know why he takes the ribbon." Patricia's face tightened. "Knowing why does not give me control over what happens next." Marcus opened the rear compartment of the vehicle. Ranger stopped at the metal step. For several seconds, he resisted by leaning backward, not against the officer, but toward the route leading to the old ferry pier. The ribbon fluttered from his mouth. Marcus waited, then applied steady pressure. Ranger climbed inside. He did not release the ribbon until the door closed and the fabric caught briefly against the metal frame. It slipped from his teeth and fell onto the floor beside him. Noah reached the vehicle too late. Through the small reinforced window, Ranger stood facing south, breathing against the glass as though he could still see the path he had failed to complete. By the time Luke returned to Port Townsend, the county vehicle was gone. Noah found him near the administration office and told him what had happened. Luke turned toward Patricia. She did not deny making the call. "A child was frightened," she said. "There were written complaints, no legal owner, and no guarantee the dog would remain predictable." "You said you would wait." "I said I would consider the arrangement." Luke looked at the empty section beneath the gate. The ribbon he had tied there was gone. He understood then that Patricia had not merely responded to an emergency. She had removed the alternative before Ranger arrived. Luke drove directly to the old ferry pier, carrying a new blue ribbon purchased from a marine supply store. Helen sat on the final bench with both hands resting in her lap. The morning had passed into afternoon, but she had not returned home. Her cane leaned against the bench and her face remained turned toward the boards leading from the road. "Is he walking slowly today?" she asked when Luke approached. Luke stopped several feet away. The question carried such ordinary hope that he could not answer immediately. He stepped closer and placed the ribbon against the back of her hand before guiding it into her palm. Helen touched the fabric once, then again. "This one is too stiff," she said, "and it's cold from your pocket." Luke sat beside her. Animal control took Ranger this morning. Helen's fingers closed around the ribbon. Her posture remained upright, but something in her expression emptied. "Thomas is gone," she said quietly. "The workshop is silent. Now the footsteps are gone too." Luke told her he would find out where Ranger had been taken. She did not respond. She held the replacement ribbon across both hands, knowing it had not traveled through the market, waited at the traffic light, or survived the ferry horn between Ranger's teeth. Luke stared toward the gray water. 5 years earlier, he had watched the storm close over Daniel Reed's last known position while command ordered the rescue aircraft back. He remembered the radio static, the fuel warning, and the moment the searchlight turned away from the waves. He had promised himself he would return at first light. By morning, the sea had erased every visible trace. Now he felt the same terrible distance opening again, someone waiting at the end of a route, and Luke arriving with nothing but an explanation for why the one they loved had not returned. This time, however, the trail had not vanished beneath the ocean. Ranger was somewhere behind a locked door, and Luke knew where to begin looking. Luke left Helen at her blue gate and drove directly to the address printed on the County Animal Services website. The facility stood beyond the northern edge of Port Townsend, between a road maintenance yard and a line of wind-bent fir trees. It was a low concrete building surrounded by chain-link fencing, with county trucks parked near the intake entrance and the overlapping sound of barking carrying across the wet parking lot. By the time Luke arrived, the afternoon light had already begun fading behind the clouds. At the front desk, a woman named Dr. Mara Collins was reviewing an intake chart. Mara was 45, tall and lean, with dark auburn hair streaked with gray and tied into a practical knot. Her green scrub jacket had been repaired at one elbow, and reading glasses hung from a cord around her neck. She had worked in emergency veterinary medicine before moving to County Animal Services after years of treating animals injured by neglect, traffic, and abandonment. The work had made her cautious about emotional stories, but not indifferent to them. She listened without interruption as Luke explained harbor lights, the blue ribbons, Helen, and Thomas Ward. When he finished, Mara turned the intake monitor toward herself. "The German Shepherd was brought in this morning," she said. "No microchip, no identification tag. The collar is too damaged to trace." "Is he injured?" "Nothing recent. His right rear leg healed badly after an old fracture. He compensates well, but cold weather probably causes pain." Luke looked toward the secured door behind the desk. "Can I see him?" Mara studied him for a moment. "You can visit. You cannot remove him. The county must hold an unidentified animal for the required claim period. If no legal owner appears, you may submit an adoption application." "I'll submit it now." "You may," she said, "but the process will not move faster because the story is meaningful." Mara led Luke through a corridor lined with metal kennels. Some dogs rushed forward, barking against the gates. Others remained curled on blankets, watching with the exhausted stillness of animals that had already learned not every approaching person opened the door for them. Ranger occupied the final kennel on the left. His old leather collar had been removed and sealed inside a clear property bag hanging beside the intake card. He lay facing the back wall, his body curved around the injured leg. The blue ribbon he had carried from Harbor Lights rested in the corner near his water bowl. It had been dampened by his breath and marked where the fabric had caught against the transport door. Luke stopped several feet from the gate. "Ranger?" One ear turned toward his voice. The dog did not rise. Mara remained behind Luke. He allowed the officer to handle him. No biting, no lunging. but he shuts down when someone reaches over his head. Luke lowered himself to the floor without moving closer. He kept his hands visible and said nothing else. Several minutes passed. The barking farther down the corridor settled into occasional restless sounds. Ranger finally turned his head. His brown eyes found Luke, then moved toward the closed door at the far end of the hall. He was not waiting for rescue from the kennel. He was measuring whether there was still a path to the pier. Luke removed the replacement blue ribbon Helen had rejected. He laid it outside the kennel and slid it forward only far enough for Ranger to see. The shepherd rose slowly. He crossed the concrete floor, stopping behind the metal gate. His nose lowered toward the ribbon. After smelling it, he lay down with one shoulder pressed against the door. "He knows what it represents," Luke said. Mara looked at the dog, then at Luke. "Put everything you told me in writing. The original incident report says repeated removal of memorial property and uncontrolled access near visitors. I cannot erase that report." "I'm not asking you to erase it. What are you asking?" "That it not be the only account attached to him." Mara gave him an additional statement form. Luke completed the adoption application before leaving. He provided his landlord's contact information, the name of a veterinary clinic, and permission for a home assessment. Over the following days, he returned during every available visiting period. He never asked Mara or the kennel attendants to bring Ranger into a private room merely to prove the dog recognized him. He sat outside the gate, sometimes reading maintenance reports, sometimes remaining silent. On the second visit, Ranger ate while Luke was present. On the third, he lay with his side against the metal bars. Luke placed the blue ribbon outside the kennel each day and removed it when he left. Ranger always watched it disappear. While Luke waited through the mandatory holding period, Noah returned alone to Thomas Ward's workshop. He had avoided the building since the argument with Luke, but Thomas's sentence from the journal would not leave him. Noah has the hands for marine mechanics and the patience he pretends not to have. Late afternoon rain tapped against the corrugated roof as Noah unlocked the desk and lifted the journal from its drawer. He intended to reread the pages about Daniel. Instead, he noticed that the wooden backing inside the drawer sat slightly forward on one side. Thomas had taught him years earlier that uneven panels often concealed repair access. Noah pressed the corner. The backing shifted. A narrow envelope had been hidden behind it. Across the front, Thomas had written, "For Noah, when anger is no longer the only thing keeping him upright." Noah stood motionless for several seconds before opening it. Inside were copies of Coast Guard radio transmissions, handwritten timing notes, and a letter from Thomas. The official report Noah had read after his father's death stated that the rescue aircraft withdrew when fuel and wind conditions exceeded operational limits. It had never explained what happened during the 6 hours before that withdrawal. Thomas's records did. The radio transcripts showed Luke repeatedly requesting permission to remain on scene after command ordered the first return. His crew's fuel reserves fell below normal safety margins while they searched through 40-foot waves and near-zero visibility. Luke redirected the rescue boat toward emergency lights from Daniel's damaged vessel and personally entered the water twice. 2 crewmen, Caleb Morris and Victor Lane, were recovered alive. Daniel had secured himself to a safety line beside an injured deckhand, but when the rescue craft was thrown away from the hull, there was room for only one man to reach the lifting sling. Daniel cut his own line and pushed the injured sailor forward. A wave struck before Luke could reach him again. The final transcript recorded Luke refusing to leave Daniel's last known position. "Command, Mercer, return immediately. Mercer, 1 man remains in the water. Command, aircraft fuel critical, return is not online." Even after the helicopter was forced back, Luke transferred to a surface vessel and continued searching until dawn. Thomas's letter was shorter. "Noah, your father was not abandoned. Luke Mercer carried the blame because surviving was the only part of that night he could not explain. Daniel made a choice to save another man. You may be angry that he made it, but do not turn Luke into the storm simply because the storm cannot hear you." Noah lowered himself into Thomas's chair. Ranger's usual place beside the desk was empty. The silence made every page feel heavier. He had spent 5 years believing Luke returned because he had chosen procedure over Daniel. The truth was harder. Luke had disobeyed procedure, risked his crew, saved 2 men, and still failed to bring Daniel home. Noah understood then that blaming Luke had protected him from another conclusion. His father had known the danger and had chosen someone else's life over his own chance of survival. That evening, Noah found Luke outside the animal services facility after visiting hours. Luke stood beside his truck, looking toward the kennel wing's narrow windows. Noah approached, carrying the envelope and radio report beneath his jacket. "You should read these," he said. Luke recognized Thomas's handwriting before taking the papers. His face changed as he read the transcripts, not with surprise, but with the pain of hearing voices he had spent years trying to silence. "You knew," Noah said. "I knew what happened." "Why didn't you tell me?" "You were 12. The official investigation was still open. Later, every explanation sounded like I was defending myself." Noah looked down at the pavement. "I called you the man who abandoned my father." Luke folded the report carefully. "You needed somewhere to put the anger." That didn't make it true. For the first time in 5 years, Noah looked directly at him without accusation. "I'm sorry, Luke." Hearing his name from Noah carried more weight than forgiveness Luke had never expected to receive. Luke reached inside his jacket and removed the brass whistle he had carried since the storm. Its edge was dented, and the faded red cord remained tied through the loop. "This belonged to Daniel," he said. "It was caught in the recovered safety line." Noah accepted it with both hands. His thumb passed over the dent in the metal. "You kept it all this time?" "I kept waiting for a moment when giving it back wouldn't look like I was asking you to release me from what happened." Noah closed his fingers around the whistle. Maybe neither of us knew how to let that night end. Behind the facility wall, a dog barked once, followed by another farther down the corridor. Luke looked toward the building. Ranger still had several days remaining on the county hold. No owner had contacted the shelter, and the adoption had not yet been approved. For now, the dog remained behind the locked door, the blue ribbon waiting outside his kennel during each visit. But one truth had finally been carried out of hiding. Daniel Reed had not been abandoned in the storm, and Luke Mercer had not stopped searching. The county holding period ended on a Thursday morning beneath a sky the color of unpolished steel. No owner had claimed Ranger, and every number attached to Luke's adoption application had been verified. Dr. Mara Collins reviewed the final documents at the front desk, then placed a microchip certificate, vaccination record, and new blue nylon leash into a plain folder. "The old fracture will always affect his gait," she said. "Keep him active, but do not force him through pain. He responds better when he understands where he is going." Luke signed the final page. "So do most of us." Mara gave him a brief, tired smile before leading him through the side door. Ranger emerged wearing a new brown leather collar. He did not leap toward Luke or pull at the leash. He stopped beneath the awning, smelled the wet air, and looked east toward Port Townsend Harbor. Luke opened the rear door of his truck. Ranger climbed inside, but instead of settling on the blanket Luke had prepared, he remained standing with his front paws braced against the seat and his attention fixed through the window. The road to Luke's apartment turned west at the first intersection. When Luke activated the turn signal, Ranger shifted sharply and looked back toward the bay. The reaction was not panic. It was unfinished purpose. Luke switched off the signal and continued toward Harbor Lights Memorial. Noah was waiting outside the southern gate. Since returning Daniel's radio records, the distance between him and Luke had changed, though neither knew what to call the new space. Noah still carried grief in the set of his shoulders, but it no longer sharpened every word he directed at Luke. His father's brass whistle hung beneath his jacket on its faded red cord. "Mara called the workshop," he said. "Helen gave her the number." Luke looked toward Ranger in the truck. "Then you know why we're here." Noah held up a length of blue ribbon cut from a roll he had found among Thomas's supplies. It was soft from age, but clean, the exact shade Thomas had used for years. Luke placed it outside the raised section of the gate rather than inside the memorial grounds. Ranger watched from the back seat as Luke returned to the truck and opened the door. The German shepherd stepped down, tested the air, and found the ribbon immediately. He lifted it by one end, careful not to drag it across the wet pavement. For a moment he looked through the iron fence toward the wreaths and bronze plaques. Then he turned away from them. Luke clipped no leash to the collar. The route ahead belonged to Ranger, but Luke and Noah followed close enough to protect him at the crossings. Ranger moved faster than he had during the earlier journey. He passed the fish market without pausing, crossed when the pedestrian signal changed, and continued through the old commercial district. The ferry horn sounded across the bay. His body tightened, but he did not stop. Noah noticed the reaction and lowered his voice. Thomas wrote that the horns frightened him. He learned not to let fear choose the route, Luke said. The words felt directed at more than the dog. Clouds had gathered over the water, pushing a hard wind through the streets. Shopkeepers pulled signs inside, and flags strained against their poles. Ranger continued toward the abandoned ferry district, the ribbon protected between his teeth. Helen Ward sat on the final bench of the old pier. She had arrived earlier than usual and wore a dark blue raincoat buttoned to her throat. Her silver hair had been secured beneath a knitted cap, and both hands rested around the handle of her cane. Since Ranger's disappearance, she had still walked to the pier each morning, though she no longer opened her hand at every approaching sound. Hope, she had discovered, could become another form of exhaustion when answered too many times by strangers' footsteps. The wind moved through the boards beneath her shoes. Then a familiar rhythm entered the pier. 3 firm taps followed by 1 lighter step. Helen raised her head. Her right hand lifted several inches from her lap, then stopped. She did not reach farther, as though moving too quickly might break whatever sound had returned. Ranger slowed before the bench. He did not release the ribbon. First, he pressed the side of his head into Helen's waiting palm. Her fingers closed around the fur beneath his ear and found the edge of the new collar. Only then did the dog lower his muzzle and place the ribbon across her knees. Helen bent until her forehead rested against his head. "You came back," she whispered. Ranger leaned against her legs, his injured foot angled away from the boards. Luke remained several steps behind. Noah turned toward the water, giving Helen the privacy of not being watched too closely. A violent gust struck the pier without warning. Farther along the shoreline, a small aluminum skiff tore free from one of its stern lines. The bow remained attached, causing the boat to swing sideways against a floating access platform below the old terminal. A young girl stood on that platform beside a red tackle box. She was 8 years old, small for her age, with curly black hair escaping from beneath a yellow rain hood. Her name was Sophie Bennett, and she had come fishing with her grandfather, a retired school custodian who had stepped back toward the parking area to retrieve a thermos. Sophie was adventurous and eager to prove she could manage without constant help, a habit strengthened by growing up with older brothers who treated every hesitation as weakness. When the skiff struck the floating platform, the impact snapped one of the platform's securing ropes. The outer edge swung away from the pier, leaving Sophie separated from the main walkway by widening black water. Ranger heard the first rope break before anyone else reacted. He released a sharp series of barks and ran toward the landward side of the pier. He did not jump onto the unstable platform. Instead, he stopped at the strongest remaining connection point and barked toward the girl, then back toward Luke. The message was clear enough. Luke ran. The tilting boards, the violent water, and the sound of strained rope pulled him backward 5 years. For one terrible second, the harbor vanished beneath the memory of 40-foot waves and Daniel Reed's last position in the storm. Luke's chest tightened. His vision narrowed around the girl's yellow coat. The old instinct to calculate every failure arrived faster than action. Then Daniel's whistle sounded behind him. Noah had raised it to his mouth and blown one hard note to catch the attention of Sophie's grandfather and nearby workers. "Luke," Noah shouted, "tell me what you need." The present returned. Secure the skiff before it hits her again. Use the north piling. Noah grabbed the loose stern line as the boat swung back. He wrapped it around the piling with a round turn and 2 half hitches, the knot Daniel had taught him when he was 9. The line snapped tight, slowing the skiff before it could crash against the platform a second time. Luke dropped onto his stomach at the edge of the pier and extended a boat hook towards Sophie. Stay low. Hold the rail with one hand and grab this with the other. The girl's face had gone pale, but she obeyed. Another gust pushed the platform outward. Ranger moved several feet along the pier and barked whenever the unstable section shifted, helping Luke anticipate its movement. He never stepped onto the loose boards or approached the child in a way that might frighten her. He remained exactly where he could see both Luke and the damaged line. Noah tightened the knot and wrapped the remaining rope around his forearm. "I've got the boat." Luke waited until the platform swung inward. He caught Sophie's wrist, pulled her across the gap, and rolled backward with the girl against his chest. Seconds later, the damaged outer corner struck the piling hard enough to split one of the boards. Sophie's grandfather reached them from the parking area. Raymond Bennett was 68, short and sturdy, with a white mustache, square glasses, and the calm voice of a man who had spent 30 years settling playground emergencies without making frightened children feel blamed. He knelt beside Sophie, checked her hands and face, then wrapped her inside his waterproof jacket. "You listened when it mattered," he told her. Only after confirming she was unhurt did he look at Luke, Noah, and Ranger. "Which one of you saw her first?" Luke pointed toward the German shepherd. Ranger had stopped barking. The moment Sophie reached safety, he sat beside the railing and watched quietly. His body relaxed except for the old stiffness in his rear leg. Patricia Caldwell stood near the entrance to the pier. She had followed Luke's truck after learning Ranger's adoption had been approved. She had intended to document whether the dog returned to the memorial or continued moving without restraint. Instead, she had witnessed the entire rescue. Ranger's warning, his refusal to enter unstable ground, and the instant he became silent when protection was no longer necessary. Patricia looked at the controlled dog she had described as an unpredictable risk. Her report had contained facts: no owner, no leash, repeated entry. But facts selected through fear had produced a story that was not complete. Ranger returned to Helen's bench and rested his head against her knee. The blue ribbon remained in her lap, dampened only by the mist. Patricia did not approach them. She closed the folder beneath her arm and watched Luke check the damaged rope, while Noah's knot held the skiff securely against the piling. For the first time, she understood that control and safety were not always the same thing. 3 days after Sophie Bennett was rescued from the damaged floating platform, Patricia Caldwell called a public meeting inside the Harbor Lights Administration Hall. The room usually held burial schedules, maintenance briefings, and discussions about decoration policies. That evening, every folding chair was occupied. Fishermen still wearing rubber boots stood along the back wall. Families of lost sailors sat beneath framed photographs of rescue crews, and several harbor workers watched from the open doorway. Helen Ward sat in the front row, with Ranger resting beside her shoes. Luke held the leash loosely, while Noah stood near the wall with Daniel's brass whistle hanging beneath his shirt. Patricia stepped behind the small wooden lectern, carrying the folder that had once described Ranger as an uncontrolled safety risk. She wore the same navy coat and carefully arranged silver blonde hair she brought to every official meeting. But her usual certainty was absent. "I asked you here because I made a decision using incomplete information," she began. She explained that Ranger had entered the memorial without permission and removed ribbons from wreaths. But she also admitted that the dog had never damaged a grave, approached a visitor aggressively, or interrupted a service. "I allowed an old fear to shape the report before I understood the full situation," she said. "The facts I included were accurate, but the truth they created was not complete." Patricia did not blame policy, the complaints, or the county officer who had followed her request. She publicly accepted responsibility for removing the ribbon Luke had placed outside the gate and arranging Ranger's capture while Luke was away. Helen listened without changing expression. When Patricia finished, she turned her face toward the lectern. "An apology matters," Helen said, "when it changes what happens next." Patricia had already prepared a proposal. Ranger would not be permitted to roam among the memorials, but the ritual would not be ended. A small station could be built outside the southern gate, beyond the burial grounds and separated from the main visitor path. Families could voluntarily attach fresh blue ribbons there, and one ribbon would be placed low enough for Ranger to reach each morning. No flower, wreath, or personal memorial item would need to be disturbed. The station would be called the Blue Ribbon Rail. The first person to volunteer was Eli Brooks, a 67-year-old retired shipwright with a square frame, white eyebrows, and hands permanently bent from decades of shaping timber. Eli spoke little, but he had once lost a younger brother in a commercial fishing accident and understood why ordinary objects could carry extraordinary weight. "I've got cedar in my shed," he said from the back row. "Weather won't take it easily." Others followed. The owner of a fabric shop offered weather-resistant ribbon. Earl Donnelly promised to inspect the rail each morning before opening the fish market. Raymond Bennett, Sophie's grandfather, offered to install a safety light along the path. Patricia created the work permit herself and signed it before the meeting ended. The Blue Ribbon Rail was completed the following week. Eli built it from 2 cedar posts joined by a smooth horizontal beam, positioned outside the southern gate where Ranger could reach it without crossing onto memorial property. A narrow brass plate carried the name, followed by a smaller line. For those who went out, those who returned, and those still waiting. Patricia insisted the wording be approved by Helen before the plate was installed. Helen ran her fingers across the raised letters, then nodded. On the first morning, only 4 ribbons moved in the harbor wind. 1 had been tied by Patricia, 1 came from Sophie and Raymond. Earl attached another before sunrise, though he denied choosing the neatest knot. The 4th belonged to Helen. She had carried it from Thomas's workshop and asked Luke to tie it at the center of the rail. Ranger approached beside Luke on his new leash. When Luke unclipped it outside the memorial boundary, the dog smelled each ribbon but selected Helen's. He drew it free without disturbing the others, turned toward the old ferry district, and began the familiar route. No one followed him for entertainment. Patricia had made that condition clear. The ritual belonged to Helen, not to curious visitors. In the weeks that followed, the Blue Ribbon Rail became part of harbor lights without becoming a spectacle. Some families tied ribbons in memory of sailors who had never come home. Others left them for living relatives still working at sea. A child wrote his father's first name on one ribbon before a long Coast Guard deployment. A widow attached hers without writing anything. Ranger continued choosing only one each morning. Luke walked with him through the busiest crossings, and Noah often joined them before work. Helen still sat on the final bench of the old ferry pier, but she no longer waited entirely alone. Some mornings Luke brought coffee in a covered cup. Noah repaired the loose board beneath the bench. Ranger rested against Helen's legs while the harbor awakened around them. They did not try to replace Thomas. Instead, they allowed a new kind of family to form around the space he had left. Luke and Noah also returned to Ward Marine Repair. At first, they worked in silence. Luke restored the corroded tools, while Noah studied Thomas's plans for the unfinished wooden launch. Gradually, Luke began teaching him the rescue skills that diagrams could not show. How to read wind across open water, how to approach a frightened survivor without making panic worse, and how to separate courage from recklessness. Noah taught Luke what Daniel had taught him about fishing lines, engines, and the moods of local currents. Their roles shifted depending on the task. Neither needed to become the other's father or son. It was enough that they stopped treating grief as a wall between them. They completed the boat by early spring. The 16-foot launch had a reinforced bow, a shallow draft, and a wide rear platform suitable for lifting someone from the water. Noah restored the engine. Luke installed emergency flotation compartments and rescue handles along both sides. Patricia arranged for the boat to be registered as part of a volunteer harbor response program. They preserved the name Thomas had written across the original blueprint, safe return. On launch day, Helen stood beside the ramp with one hand on Ranger's collar. Noah tied a blue ribbon around the forward rail before starting the engine. Luke checked the knot, then looked at Noah. "Your father would have checked it twice." Noah smiled faintly. "Thomas would have checked it 3 times. They did both. Safe return entered the bay beneath a clear morning sky. Noah handled the controls while Luke watched the shoreline. For years, open water had carried Luke back to the night Daniel disappeared. That morning it carried him toward something unfinished, but no longer impossible. The boat did not erase the storm. It gave the memory somewhere new to go. Helen's life also changed in quieter ways. Luke repaired the loose latch on her blue gate and installed raised labels on the emergency settings of her radio. Noah began stopping by after work, sometimes bringing engine parts for her to identify by touch because Thomas had once taught her the shapes. Patricia visited without official papers and learned to announce herself before opening the gate. Ranger divided his time between Luke's apartment, the workshop, and Helen's kitchen floor. At night, he slept near Luke's door at first. Gradually, he moved his blanket closer to the living room. Months later, Luke woke to find the dog asleep beside the couch rather than guarding the exit. It was the first sign that Ranger no longer expected every shelter to be temporary. One cold morning, Luke arrived at Harbor Lights before sunrise. Frost edged the bronze plaques, and the bay beyond the wall was almost motionless. He loaded his cart with distilled water, soft brushes, wooden picks, and the approved bronze solution. Then he walked directly to the black granite panel bearing the names of those never recovered. Daniel Reed's plaque waited on the 3rd column. For 5 years, Luke had cleaned every name around it. This time, he placed his cloth across Daniel's engraved letters. He removed the pale mineral line beneath the name, cleared corrosion from the mounting screws, and polished the bronze until it reflected the first thin light over the harbor. There was no voice from the past, no sudden release large enough to erase what had happened. Daniel remained dead. Luke remained the man who had returned, but returning no longer meant abandoning him. Luke removed his old Coast Guard rescue badge from his jacket. The metal was scratched along one edge from years of being carried without being displayed. He placed it beneath Daniel's name, beside the weathered flowers and challenge coins left by others. The badge was not an apology or a request for forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement that the rescue had ended, even if the love and responsibility carried from it had not. Outside the southern gate, Ranger waited beside the blue ribbon rail. A fresh ribbon rested gently between his teeth. Noah stood near him with Daniel's whistle beneath his shirt, and Helen waited at the old ferry pier where the morning wind moved across the empty bench beside her. Luke closed his maintenance cart and walked toward them. Ranger turned down the harbor road, carrying the ribbon along the path Thomas had once shaped through love. This time, the dog was not preserving a promise alone. He had a home behind him, a family ahead of him, and people walking beside him all the way. Sometimes, God does not answer grief by returning what we have lost. Instead, He sends someone, or even an animal, to walk beside us until we are strong enough to move forward again. Ranger could never bring Thomas or Daniel home, but every blue ribbon carried a message that love does not disappear when a life ends. It continues through the promises we keep, the people we forgive, and the kindness we choose when rules and fear tell us to turn away. Perhaps you are still holding on to a tradition for someone you miss. Maybe an animal once stayed beside you during a time when no human words could bring comfort. Tell us about that person, that memory, or that faithful companion in the comments. And what would you have done in Patricia's position? Followed the rules immediately, or protected Ranger's ritual until a safer solution could be found? May God bless every person living with an empty chair, heal the hearts carrying silent guilt, and guide us toward those who are still waiting to be noticed. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next powerful stories about loyalty, courage, faith, and second chances.